Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance, the final stretch. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. It's been a long journey since 2021, and really since 2022 began, when we identified the likely outcome that would take Bitcoin dominance from 38% to 60%. And we are finally almost there. So, in this video, what I want to do is I want to briefly recap what has happened so far, talk about where we are right now, and talk about the final stretch for the Bitcoin dominance rally, which I think will come to an end before the end of the year. Okay? So, if you're unfamiliar with the views that I've expressed on Bitcoin dominance, essentially it states that Bitcoin USD, whether it goes up or down, Bitcoin dominance will go up. So, if Bitcoin goes up on its USD pair, Bitcoin dominance will go higher. If Bitcoin goes down on its USD pair, Bitcoin dominance will go higher. And the reason for this is because of monetary policy. It has nothing to do with anything else that a lot of people focus on, in my opinion. It doesn't have to do with the news cycle. It doesn't have to do with upgrades by various altcoins, whether it be Ethereum transitioning from proof of work to proof of stake. It has nothing to do with any of that stuff. The deflationary mechanism. It has nothing to do with which meme coins are being shilled by a creator. None of that stuff. Okay? All the Bitcoin dominance rally ever had to do with was the understanding that things had gotten too heated back in 2021, and that the Fed was likely going to raise rates and go through a period of quantitative tightening that would cause investors to systematically flee higher risk assets in each asset class for lower risk assets within each asset class. That was the only reason. In fact, if you look last cycle, one of the reasons why I've been so adamant about Bitcoin dominance going higher all this time is when you overlay two different metrics, interest rates in the United States, and if you were to overlay the balance sheet of the Fed, you will see a very compelling story. And that story states that it wasn't until after the Fed cut rates in 2019 that Bitcoin dominance finally topped. It wasn't until after the Fed began to expand their balance sheet last cycle that Bitcoin dominance topped. And because we could look back and see what happens during tighter monetary policy, we have followed this every step of the way, right? And I have been adamant that this would be the most likely outcome for essentially the last 3 to 3.5 years. Now, I believe that Bitcoin dominance is in the final stretch of this multi-year rally. And I want to talk about how it will likely come to an end. Okay? So, the reason, and again, one of the things I told you guys many years ago as well was that by the end of this, most of you would likely become Bitcoin maxis, because the way the cycle works is you get an alt season year, and then you get 3 years that involve Bitcoin dominance going higher, right? So you get Bitcoin dominance going higher year 1, 2, and 3, and then in year 4, Bitcoin dominance goes lower. But it is in year 4 when retail investors typically arrive in mass, and that's the reason why Bitcoin dominance goes down. And those retail investors, when they arrive, they think that altcoins will always outperform Bitcoin because in the year they arrived, all they saw was altcoins outperform Bitcoin. So they don't know any different, right? They missed out on the 3-year dominance rally that came before they arrived. And therefore, when they enter into the cryptoverse, all they see is altcoins outperforming Bitcoin. And then what happens is those people spend the next 3 years calling for alt season, where Bitcoin dominance goes down, but they just are disappointed month after month, year after year. And so, again, I said this more than 3 years ago that a lot of you guys would become Bitcoin maxis by the end of it. I'm sure many of you are probably like, yep, that's me. I just want to say that it is important to realize that while it has been very easy to just wear your Bitcoin maxi hat for the last 3 to 3.5 years, I just want to say that, you know, next year, I actually think Bitcoin dominance will go down. Um, and this is one of those things where I feel like over the last 3 years, 3 years, I have attracted a lot of Bitcoin maxis to the channel because of my views on Bitcoin dominance. Um, and I obviously I pissed off a lot of people that didn't like that. And now, just to sort of be clear about my own emotions, right? I mean, I am nervous to sort of talk about the reverse of all this stuff with Bitcoin dominance, but if you're not pissing someone off, you're probably not doing it right. So I do think Bitcoin dominance will go down next year. Okay. So there's still this missing piece potentially, though, that still needs to happen this year. And we've gotten really, really close. Now, one of the things that we noticed happened just a week ago or so was Bitcoin dominance wicked, I believe, to 58%. Now, you're not going to see it on the weekly candles. It'll just say that the high is 57.71%. But I do believe if you were to go to the hourly, you can see that, and I don't know why TradingView does it like this, but if you go to the hourly, you can see, in fact, there was a wick by Bitcoin dominance to right around that 58% level. I think if you even go to the minute time frame or something, you will see it hit 58%. I know because I posted about it on Twitter when it actually happened. So, or X, whatever the cool kids are calling it. But it's happening, right? And it's been happening for a very long time. So I would say this. I would say that, if you look, right, if you were to look at Bitcoin dominance monthly candles, monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, in fact, monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, one of the things you'll notice is that you really haven't even had a red one since 2022, right? The last red Bitcoin dominance monthly Heikin-Ashi candle was November of 2022. And there's been a lot of people that have faded this entire move by Bitcoin dominance. But look, it never really stopped going up. Now, certainly there were times, right? Certainly there were times where it seemed like it was done, right? And it felt like it was done. If you think back just a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago, there were a lot of excited people about this move by ETH on its Bitcoin pair back in May. Do you guys remember with the hype of the spot ETF? But I said that doesn't mean anything with regards to ETH Bitcoin. And I think the reason was always because, well, I mean, Bitcoin has an ETF too, right? So, just add it to the list of reasons why people think ETH is going to outperform Bitcoin, and then it still just doesn't. Now, to continue to hold that very contentious view for too much longer is somewhat dangerous. I think that ETH Bitcoin bottoms in the 0.03 to 0.04 range, and it already hit 0.04. So there does exist a scenario where the low for ETH Bitcoin is 0.04. Okay. With that said, there is still very much a risk that it goes below 0.04. And one of the reasons for that, and I want to show this pretty clearly on the ETH Bitcoin chart, is look at the last 2 cycles where you had sort of a very similar setup. Okay. One of the things you may notice is that in sort of this first cycle, ETH Bitcoin had a monthly close below the range low, right? So the range low was right here in 2016, and it had a monthly close below it, but the month that marked the first month with a monthly close below the range low was not the low for ETH Bitcoin. It was, in fact, the following month, right? It was the following month where it occurred. Now look at the cycle that came after that, right? Where you had sort of a double peak cycle. You set a low. Now, what was the first month where ETH Bitcoin had a monthly close below the range low? So back over here, the range low would have been 0.02312. You can see the first month it went below that was July 2019, coincidentally the same month that the Fed cut rates, right? That was when they cut rates. And that was when it fell below. Now look closely. You had that month where it put in a monthly close below the range low, but it was not the low. You still had one more red month, and then it actually wicked below that the following month. Right? So about 1 to 2 months later. And even over here, right, it was basically the following month, and then the month after that ran the lows again, didn't quite take it out. But do you see that pattern? Monthly close below the range low, monthly close below the range low. And then you had a red, green, right? Red, green. Where are we today, right, with ETH Bitcoin? Well, believe it or not, and I know this sounds crazy, but ETH Bitcoin has still not had a monthly close below the range low, right? The range low was 0.04908, 0.04908. And despite my best efforts to get you guys to believe for the last several years, ETH Bitcoin has still not had a close on the monthly time frame below 0.04908. It did come pretty close in April, where it closed at 0.04968, and then it came pretty close in July, where it closed at 0.05001. But still, it never actually had a monthly close below the range low. But if ETH Bitcoin does not manage to get back up to 0.04908 before the end of August, then it will mark the first monthly close below the range low that we've set this cycle. Now remember, the last two times, the first close below the range low was not the actual low, but it was only 1 to 2 months away. Only 1 to 2 months away. Which means if it were to repeat, then September could be the time. Now it's possible it gets delayed beyond that. Believe me, I have spent many, many months wondering when this was going to occur. And every single time I thought it was going to occur, I tipped my hat to the degens. They ran it right back up, right? Again, I tipped my hat. No hate, right? I was impressed. After all this time, we are now at 0.044. And I think to myself, right? Is this it? Is this the time where we finally get the monthly close below the range low? We clean up shop in September, October, and then prepare for ETH Bitcoin to turn around next year? I think it's possible. Okay. So watch ETH Bitcoin, because it really does dictate the altcoin market. And the other reason that I think Bitcoin dominance still has another move ahead, even though it's gone up so much, and it is dangerous to stay bullish on it, you know, when it's been in an uptrend for so long. But look, everyone's told me I've been wrong for so many years, and the reason that made me bullish on it in the first place hasn't actually changed. And so because of that, I can't be compelled to change my mind just because people tell me that, you know, I'm wrong again, when it's never been wrong to be bullish on dominance for the last 3 years. It was never wrong. I think people just didn't want to see their altcoins bleed back to the king. But this is the way the cycle works. And in fact, if you look at Bitcoin dominance, it's basically at the same level it was at just before the Fed cut rates in 2019. The other reason why I think Bitcoin dominance is going to go higher, apart from monetary policy, right? If you throw monetary policy out the door and say that it doesn't matter, okay, if you just say it doesn't matter, you throw it out the door. And if you just say, you know, it doesn't really matter, you know, whether the Fed's cutting rates or raising rates or what the balance sheet is. Okay. But what I go back to are alt Bitcoin pairs. And I know so many of you guys are so convinced that your alt is better than Bitcoin, right? I get it, because I was once you, right? That was me once upon a time. And I'm just here to say this. In 10 years, if Bitcoin is trading for, I don't know, 300K or 400K, then you know the Cryptoverse is doing okay, right? You know things are okay. But the problem is that if in 10 years no one cares about Bitcoin, then no one's going to care about your altcoin either. So if you're an altcoin person, if you hold on to altcoins and you're constantly bashing on Bitcoin and comparing it to the, to the AOL of the internet or whatever, or the MySpace of social media, if you're always saying that there's something that's better that's going to come along and take over, I think you're wrong, right? I think you're off base. I think that if Bitcoin cannot survive, then your altcoin has no chance. But if Bitcoin survives, which I ultimately think it will, then there's a chance that your altcoin can do something. So don't root against the king. The king's the only reason why you're here. If Bitcoin didn't exist, your altcoin would mean absolutely nothing. So the other reason besides monetary policy, which is why I think Bitcoin dominance is going higher, is because I believe that alt Bitcoin pairs are oscillators at best and bleeders at worst. And the reason I say that is just looking at the chart. This is total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. It gives us an understanding of what alt Bitcoin pairs fundamentally do. And you can see pretty clearly that they go to the range lows every few years. And at the range lows, they reach approximately 1/4 of Bitcoin's market cap. You see that? 0.25. 0.25. Oscillators at best. So I can't be compelled to believe that this time is different, right? And I've said this forever, and it's made me a ton of enemies, but if they're oscillators at best, why would I assume that they can't go down here, which is where they eventually went in the last 2 market cycles? If they make that move from current valuations, alt Bitcoin pairs could still drop another 35%. I know what you're thinking. You're probably saying, well, Ben, you said that 6 months ago, right? But look at the chart, right? I mean, it hasn't stopped going down. It hasn't been wrong. It's just taking a long time for it to play out. It doesn't mean it's wrong. Directionally speaking, alt Bitcoin pairs have not really stopped going down since September of 2021. They put in new lows only 2 months ago. So how can we say that the analysis is wrong if they're putting in new lows on an ongoing basis? Just 2 months ago, they were putting in a new low. And this month, they almost put in a new low. So when I look at this chart, I think, how is it possible that they don't eventually go to the lows? Because alts are oscillators at best. And if you look at the top of the range, guess where they tend to top out at? Where they reach approximately parity with Bitcoin, where the market cap of the altcoin market is essentially equal to the market cap of Bitcoin. 0.99, or sometimes wicking up to slightly above 1. Now, why do I say alts are oscillators at best, right? You hear me say that a lot. Why don't I just say that they're oscillators? Why do I say at best? Well, the reason I say at best is because technically speaking, and being technically correct is the best way to be correct, that's a high, that's a lower high. That's a low, that's a lower low, right? So technically speaking, which is the only thing that really matters, who cares about the narratives? Technically speaking, you have a high, you have a low, and you have a high, and then you have a lower low, and you have a lower high. So sometimes when I think to myself about, where alt Bitcoin pairs are going, and I say, look, I'm just trying to be reasonable, right? Work with me here. And I'm saying 0.25, I'm giving alts the benefit of the doubt. I am. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt in my view. I'm essentially saying, you know what? I'm going to ignore the fact that that's a high and that's a lower high and that's a low and that's a lower low. I'm ignoring that and saying I'll throw the degens a bone and say they're potentially oscillators. And therefore, if they're oscillators, then they get to go to 0.25. And that seems reasonable to me, right? It's possible that they are oscillators, right? It's possible that this is the correct way to view the market, where that's just a deviation above the range high, and that's just a deviation below the range low. And instead of being bleeders, they just move around between the low and the high, and occasionally they break out of these bounds, but when they do, it just represents an even better trade to prepare for in the opposite direction, right? So like in 2018, when all Bitcoin pairs were way up here, it made sense to get prepared for the Bitcoin dominance rally that then lasted for over 3 years. When all Bitcoin pairs are down here at 0.25, it makes sense to start preparing for them to go back in the other direction. But do you see why I say they're oscillators at best? Now, that's the reason why I say, even if you don't care about monetary policy, it seems likely that they're going to eventually break down. And if you're sitting there and saying, well, it's been taking so long, remember that last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs did not drop below the range low until 1 month before the first rate cut. The Fed cut rates in July, and alt Bitcoin pairs broke down in June. Now, there's a good chance that the Fed is going to cut rates in September, meaning that if we were to follow the prior cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs would break down this month. But you could already argue that they have. In fact, if you look at the range low, we already had a monthly close below it last month at 0.39 because the range low was 0.4. So you could argue it's already happened. But now I wonder if it's starting to extend that move, right? Now, I said a few weeks ago, I think the time frame for all Bitcoin pairs to break down is likely going to be, about a month before the first rate cut. I don't know if, it's hard to time it exactly. It's hard to time it perfectly. If you look at alt Bitcoin pairs in general, and you look at, say, like an 8-week moving average, or you look at the bull market support band, you can see that alt Bitcoin pairs have essentially been guided down by the 8-week SMA for the most part for many, many months. And also, the last time that alt Bitcoin pairs were above their bull market support band was back in April. So, to me, it just looks like people are fighting, and they're trying to hang on as long as they possibly can until there's a catalyst where they finally break down. Now, if you were to look at Bitcoin dominance and say, find me another reason, right, why dominance is going to go higher, right? Let's say you don't care about monetary policy. Let's say you don't care about alt Bitcoin pairs. Let's say you're a TA person, right? Which, again, the TA stuff is hand wavy at best, right? If you were to look at what happened last cycle when Bitcoin dominance broke down, one of the things you'll notice is that it actually topped at the 0.618 fib retracement, right? That's where Bitcoin dominance finally topped. And what's fascinating is that Bitcoin USD topped when Bitcoin dominance passed the 0.5 fib extension. You see that right there? That was in the summer of 2019. So if you were to overlay Bitcoin USD onto this chart, you will see, in fact, that it was precisely when Bitcoin dominance passed the 0.5 fib extension is where Bitcoin USD put in its mid-cycle top. When Bitcoin dominance passed the 0.5 fib extension. Now, I want to draw your attention to this cycle. And we've talked about this forever, so don't say, why are you just now bringing it up? If you look at Bitcoin dominance this cycle, from when it broke down, it's making the move, right? It's above 0.5. But do you see where it first crossed the 0.5 level? Back over here earlier this year, which coincidentally marked the mid-cycle top. exactly what it did in 2019. It's also when gold broke out in 2019. So it's playing out in a very, very, very familiar fashion for those who care to look. It's easy to sit over there and mock Bitcoin dominance because you don't understand it or you think it's incapable of making you money. But I'm telling you, for those that care to get it, it is the key to unlocking the secrets of the cryptoverse. You can see that once it tagged 0.5, that's what marked the local top for Bitcoin USD. And it's been putting in lower highs and lower lows ever since, which was not something people wanted to hear back in March. And you can see that it's now breaking above 0.5. And where is 0.618, you ask? It's at 60%, right? So I think that Bitcoin dominance is in this last move to 60%. I could see it hitting it as soon as September. It is possible, right? My two most likely time frames for it to hit 60, either September or December. September or December. Right now, I'm somewhat partial to September, in fact. Where it's funny because if you asked me 2 months ago, I would have leaned towards December. But the reason why is because we have to be willing to adapt to the market, you know? And when I look at this, one of the things I notice about September is that typically, if you draw lines through every prior September, Bitcoin dominance reverses course from whatever it was doing going into it, right? So September 2023, it went down into it, and then it went up after it. September 2022, it was going down into September, and then it went up after it. September 2021, it was going down into September, and then it went up after it. September 2020, it was going down into it, and then it went up after it. September 2019, same thing. It was going up into it, and then it went down after it. So I'm open-minded, right? If Bitcoin dominance goes to 60% in September, then maybe that's it. It's possible, right? That it's possible, especially if you look at ETH Bitcoin and you're like, well, if this is the month with the first monthly close below the range low, if it is, right? If the degens can just exercise some self-control for more than 5 minutes and we finally get a monthly close below 0.049, then what does that mean? That next month, September, well, just like 2019, is the ETH Bitcoin low? Or at least within a month, because back then it did go a little bit lower the following month. Or like 2016. It's possible, guys. You know, it really is. So, you know, when I look at Bitcoin dominance and I try to figure out, you know, what's it going to do, it's been building up to this move for months. And now it's finally breaking free. You know, people are throwing in the towel because the Fed is staying higher for much longer than most people thought. And that's why alt Bitcoin pairs continue to essentially be stuck in traffic on Struggle Street, as they say. And again, you know, Bitcoin dominance is understanding is how it helps you preserve your Satoshi valuation. Because, you know, a lot of people look at things like ETH Bitcoin and you know, and dot Bitcoin and link Bitcoin and ADA Bitcoin and Matic Bitcoin and Sol Bitcoin and Aave Bitcoin, right? But it's somewhat abstract, right? If you're not really familiar with crypto, what does 0.04487 even mean practically, right? Well, it means that one ETH is worth about 4.5% of one Bitcoin, right? Again, it's still somewhat abstract. A better way to think about it is to take the inverse. Okay, 1 divided by ETH Bitcoin. I think a lot of people, you know, have a bias to assume that the charts just go up and to the right. And so when you take the inverse, it looks a lot more clear, right? And so back in the merge in September of 2022, 1 Bitcoin would have fetched you 11.7 ETH. Today, it gets you 22 ETH. Remember back then when I said you can basically double up your ETH just by putting it into Bitcoin and waiting? Well, there you have it. 11 ETH, 22 ETH. So the same thing could be done on many other charts, right? Dot Bitcoin, same thing. You know, take the inverse of one, you know, take the inverse of dot Bitcoin and you'll see it, right? I mean, In 2021, when Bitcoin got you 986 dot, today it gets you almost 13,000 dot. Every time I do this chart, right, I have to push this higher. Almost 13,000. Look at ADA. It's the same thing. Same exact thing. Every time I make the chart, I have to take it higher. One Bitcoin used to get you around 16,000 ADA. Now it gets you 175,000 ADA, right? This is why dominance matters. And when you look at this chart, you can see that it was always the most likely outcome. Because alts are oscillators at best. Not at worst, at best. Matic Bitcoin, same thing, right? I've been talking about this one forever too. And what happens oftentimes is, like, in 2022 when Matic Bitcoin was doing well, people use that as the reason why the Bitcoin dominance theory was wrong. But you can see that given enough time, you just got to keep on raising it up. And once upon a time, one Bitcoin got you around 16,000 Matic. Today, it gets you 139,000 Matic. 139,000. AVAX. I told you guys back in March that it was likely going to come back down to the range lows by the end of the year. Looks like it's on track to me. Take the inverse. 1 divided by AVAX Bitcoin, right? I got to raise it up from when I last showed you. In 2021, 1 Bitcoin would get you around 383 at AVAX, right down here. Today, 1 Bitcoin gets you 2,800 AVAX. So that's why it matters, right? Algorand, right? Algo Bitcoin. What is there to say? I mean, like just look at the chart, right? Now, I mean, maybe it's a bleeder. Maybe it'll never have another day in the sun. It's possible. But I'm telling you, a lot of these alts haven't even had a chance to bottom on their Bitcoin pairs because monetary policy hasn't changed, So, in 2019, if you gave up on all the alts that were kept going down before the Fed cut rates, then you would have thrown in the towel too soon. But my point back in 2022 was, don't wait to figure out which ones are going to do this. Just stick with Bitcoin until looser monetary policy arrives, right? And again, you can see that in 2021, 1 Bitcoin would have fetched you, I got to take the inverse of this, right? 1 over Algo Bitcoin. Once upon a time, 1 Bitcoin would have gotten you 18,000 Algorand. Today, 1 Bitcoin gets you 495,000 Algorand. So, again, this is why Bitcoin dominance matters. I do think it is in the final stretch of its rally, though. I do. I think that the final mile, right, is coming up. And one thing too is not just alt Bitcoin pairs like total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, which does suggest there's still room for it to go down. There's also others Bitcoin, which is everything outside of the top 10. Now, others Bitcoin is something I've mentioned many, many times. And early this year, a lot of the degens were telling me why I was wrong about Bitcoin dominance because of others Bitcoin and how those were doing well. Well, they just put on a new low for the cycle. So, again, it was just a dead cat bounce, right? Now, is it possible that it's a double bottom? It's possible, especially given how close Bitcoin dominance is to 60%. Perhaps it's ETH that gets Bitcoin dominance to 60%. Perhaps it's something else. The only other thing I would say is that when you look at last cycle and you overlay interest rates onto the chart, you will see that others Bitcoin dropped 60%, rose 60% after the Fed cut rates, and then dropped another 60% as the Fed cut rates, or as that materialized. Same thing this cycle, right? Drop 60, go up 60 or 70, and then they're down, 40 or so far. If they drop 60 as the Fed cuts, that gets you down to 0.11. And again, I know it might sound crazy, but that's what happened last cycle. One thing to note, though, is that when others Bitcoin does crash back down to the lows like it has right now, there's cases to be made, right? That when it first does it, it likes to get a bounce off of that level before going below it, right? It did it over here, right? It set a low over here, it bounced. So you could argue that it set this low and then sort of bounced for a couple of months and then it finally broke through. So is that going to happen? Could that happen? It's possible, and that's why I say I think Bitcoin dominance could top as early as September. But, if you get some type of shenanigans going on with others' Bitcoin and it bounces for a couple of months, then it is still possible for Bitcoin dominance not to top until December. Okay. So, it kind of depends on, whether it does this or whether it just goes down. And again, there does exist a scenario where others' Bitcoin just bottoms right around here. But in order for that to happen, I think that the higher market cap alts need to give up more of their market share, give it back to Bitcoin. One of the things that I mentioned back in March was USDT dominance, and how if you look at it, anytime it hits this trend line, Bitcoin usually gets a larger correction. And it flushes the altcoin market out, right? This time was not different. USDT dominance continues to go higher. If you were to look at Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance, guess what? It's breaking up at the same spot it was doing it in 2019 when the Fed cut rates, right? In June of 2019, Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance was also at 63%, 62 to 63%, 1 month before the first rate cut. Guess where it is today? 62 to 63%, theoretically just 1 month before the first rate cut. So it really does make sense. It does when you view it like that and you're like, well, I mean, it certainly seems like, it could go higher. I don't know why not, right? So, and again, the other one is Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, right? I think it's going to break through 73%. It's gotten close, but it hasn't sustained it yet. So we'll see. We'll see when that happens. And then finally, on this one, Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins, right? It's been moving up this trend line for a long time. And you can argue that it already tagged this trend line here, the sort of the more conservative one, where you connect this dot with that one, and then you ignore this one from 2022, and then you connect it to that. That's where it just tagged, okay? But there's another trend line, more dubious one, where you connect 2021 to 2022, and coincidentally, if it were to go up there in September, that would put dominance excluding stablecoins at around 64.5%, 3% higher than it currently is. But 3% higher than Bitcoin dominance currently is when you include stablecoins, puts you at 60% because it's already at 57. So again, it seems like it's playing out. It's a slow process. And I hope a lot of you guys have come to appreciate just how slow this process is. But it also goes to show how once you understand, where monetary policy is going, it makes sense to plan for that. Now, with that said, we need to understand that monetary policy is likely to loosen up at some point later this year and into 2025. So that's why it makes sense to assume that Bitcoin dominance will go down next year. In fact, if you were to just simply look at Bitcoin dominance yearly candles, right? Yearly candles for Bitcoin dominance, you'll see that essentially it just goes up for 3 years and then drops for 1, right? So I do wonder if you're just going to see it do the same thing, right? Where next year Bitcoin dominance drops back down after everyone has given up, everyone stops calling for alt season, and then it finally, manifests. But not until next year, okay? So, yeah, dominance, you can see that the two big red candles are post-halving years, 2017 and 2021. 2025 would be the next one, which, again, is still several months away. It's only August, and we still have to get through the rest of the year. So, I think that we have covered this in so much detail for so long that I do appreciate you guys being part of the journey. The Bitcoin dominance journey for me is coming to an end relatively soon. Okay, it is. And it could be as early as next month. I just want to be clear about that. This has more or less played out how I would have expected it to. And as looser monetary policy arrives, dominance should start to falter some. And the expectation would be that it would start to trend back down. And again, it has nothing to do with what I want or what you want or what I think is going to make people happy or make people mad. It just has to do with what I think is going to happen based on monetary policy. If you were to look at the social risk, right? Social risk has done something very similar this year as it did in 2019, where it rallied on up to around 0.3 social risk, and then it came right back down. Same exact thing, right? It wasn't until the following year where social risk really went back up, and that's when Bitcoin dominance went down. 2017, Bitcoin dominance went down, but guess what? The social risk was going up. But do you see why? Because again, if you go to the workbench and you overlay Bitcoin dominance, right? If we take Bitcoin dominance, let's go Bitcoin dominance without stable coins. And if we just simply overlay the social risk, you can see that, well, when Bitcoin dominance is going up, social risk is going down, more or less. And we've seen the same thing happen this cycle. So makes a lot of sense. Now, as we get more and more labor market data that comes in, right? We already got the SOM rule that, and I said this before, one of the reasons why Bitcoin dominance is going to top is because some of these metrics that we've been following, right? Like the SOM rule recession indicator, it just signaled a recession signal, And a lot of people are going to be like, well, who knows if and I don't know either. But the point is this is the stuff the Fed looks at, right? They look at this stuff. Claudia Sum was the economist who developed it. And, she thinks it's giving a false signal. Who the hell knows? But the point is that it's giving a signal, which means whether you believe a recession is coming or not, it means looser monetary policy is coming. That's what it means. And if looser monetary policy is coming, then Bitcoin dominance is going to be topping relatively soon. Could have already happened, theoretically. I still think, September at the earliest, maybe December at the latest. That's my general view, and we're starting to see some of the reasons why, right? The labor market is showing weakness. Look at job openings per unemployed worker, right? I mean, it's back down to the pre-pandemic levels. They haven't cut rates yet, right? I mean, this is likely only going to get worse until they cut rates, and even then, it's probably going to get worse because they're not going to cut rates quick enough, more than likely. So this is the reason why Bitcoin dominance will likely top out in the next 3 to 4 months. Okay, it's because, or before the end of the year, I should say, it's because these metrics, which once showed a lot of excess, that excess is gone, right? The labor market has softened up, and one of the ways to view that is just go look at the unemployment rate. Just simply go look at the unemployment rate, and you will see, in fact, that when the unemployment rate starts to break above, it's let's look at this. Let me go over to a monthly time frame. So when it starts to break above, here's a 24-month moving average, right? When it breaks above it, it typically goes nonlinear, and you can see that it's starting to really go up here. It's not different, guys. It's not. I mean, again, you can even take a bar pattern from the financial crisis, and you can overlay it and see that it's almost identical. You can take .com and overlay it and see that, guess what? It's also more or less identical. You can take 1988, 1989, and going into early 1990 and see that, again, it's more or less identical. The unemployment rate is increasing at the same time it always does. This time has not been different. We feel like it's different. We feel like, oh, it's special. It's different this time. It's actually the exact same thing, right? And because it's the exact same thing, that means monetary policy is going to loosen up soon. And because monetary policy is going to loosen up soon, it means Bitcoin dominance is likely going to top soon. Okay? So, to be clear, right? Because, some people say that, it's too ambiguous. I think dominance is going to top this year. Okay? And I've said this forever. I think I said before, I said the second half of 2024. So when it topped last cycle, the second half in December of 2020. So I think dominance is going to top in the second half of 2024. And the reason, it's not because your altcoin has a great community. It's just simply because the labor market is giving out distress signals. And that means the Fed's going to come to the rescue before the end of the year, more than likely. And because the Fed's going to come to the rescue, Bitcoin dominance will then top out. I think the top is 60%. I could be wrong, right? Maybe it's 58, maybe it's 59, maybe it's 62, right? Maybe it's 64. I don't know. I think 60% is a reasonable target. I think it always has been. It always will be. That's my view. Bitcoin dominance, in my opinion, is going to 60%. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.